Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the Hague Institute for Global Justice this afternoon for the second annual Madeleine Albright Lecture on Global Justice. This lecture series is supported generously by the City of The Hague. I would therefore like to begin by inviting Dr. Elizabeth Miniman, Program Director for International Affairs at the Municipality of The Hague, to say a few words.
Thank you, Abby. Good afternoon, Excellencies, Mr. Axworthy, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, Abby. On behalf of the Municipality of The Hague, I would like to welcome you in our city and, of course, here for the lecture at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, what we look at a bit at our Institute for Global Justice. It's an honor for our city that the second Madeleine Albright Lecture will be delivered by former Foreign Minister of Canada, Dr. Lloyd Axworthy. And I think you can read the topic, but I still like to read it to you. Pursuing Justice in a Globalized World, Reflections on the Commitment of Madeleine Albright. Last year, Madeleine Albright, and the chair, she is not only the former US Secretary of State, but she's also the chair of the Hague Institute Advisory Council, gave the first lecture. And she concluded her lecture with a quote I want to give you by stating that such cooperation means embracing a vision of justice and security that is practical, interconnected, and achievable. I choose this quote because I think it really suited to both the city of The Hague, a city of peace and justice, and the work of the Hague Institute at the intersection of security, justice, and governance. The Hague Institute, the day after launching the Commission on Security, Justice, and Governance new report, Confronting the Crisis of Global Governance at the Peace Palace. The report is a joint initiative between the Hague Institute and the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and it examines the challenges facing the current global governance architecture in fragile states, climate change, and in our connected global economy. On the other hand, the report also underlines the role that cities can play, and that is what is my role here. The responsibility a city has to bear to promote a peaceful and fair world. And The Hague, as city of peace and justice, doesn't only want to have peace and justice in its name, but we also want to contribute to peace and justice in this world. We feel responsible to deal with the natural resources we've been given and not to be a burden to future generations. And for us, the city is not just another abstract level of government, but it's a living human community. And you might have heard that there's a lot of discussions of how, as a city, you can contribute. And I would like to share some examples, two examples of how the city of The Hague thinks that we can take our role of, on the one hand, being a local player, and cities are by definition local, and on the other hand, that we hope to have global impact. We do that by actively stimulating new innovations for social challenges in cooperation with, on the one hand, government agencies, because we are the city where the government is located. On the other hand, the private sector, knowledge institutions, and international institutions. And you might have heard it before, there are more than 160 international institutions here in The Hague, and it's wonderful that they are here, but it's even better if they cooperate, because that's the way how you achieve more results. I would like to give you two examples of what we are doing, and if you find it interesting, you can find me everywhere to talk hours about it. What we What we just did is in the beginning of June, we started with a new project. It's called the Hague Humanity Hub. And the Hague Humanity Hub is, on the one hand, a future building, which might be, hopefully, is open in 2017 summer. And on the other hand, it's a concept about cooperation. It's a place where international organizations come together for innovations, for peace and justice, and for the humanitarian sector. The way we want to achieve it is, on the one hand, to simply bring parties together. We have a strong belief that innovation has an accidental component. You cannot plan all innovation. You have to bring parties together to facilitate multi-stakeholder engagement. And what we do is we bring parties together in a building, in programs, in grants for projects where cooperation is mandatory. And we hope by that to stimulate innovation on the topics that are much to our heart. And I would like to give you one example of the first projects where the municipality was engaged. One of the groups we work together with, and I'm looking around if somebody is in the room, is the Center for Innovation of the University of Leiden. And they have an initiative that's called Big Data for Peace and Humanity. And some weeks ago, they have invited colleagues from the World Food Programme, and they have worked a week very hard. I've seen only pictures, but they all looked tired and satisfied, because what they did is to use data for more efficiency in the humanitarian sector to save money. And they concluded in the end of their session that the money they saved by applying data for efficiency had them save enough to provide food to an additional 100,000 people. Of course, that's a smashing result, and I cannot claim that all the projects we do have that big results, but that's our aim, to bring together people, because that's what you do as a city. We don't conduct the research ourselves, but we want to attract the parties that want to come together and to work for a better world, and we help them with the best we have to offer. And I think a wonderful example of the best we have to offer is inspiring lectures at this inspiring institute. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you very much.
Dr. Minnemann, thank you for your remarks and the steadfast support that The Hague, the international city of peace and justice, continues to provide for initiatives such as this lecture and the other initiatives you mentioned in your talk. The Madeleine Albright Lecture on Global Justice, together with the Justice Stephen Breyer Lecture on International Law, which takes place annually in Washington, D.C., anchors the fruitful transatlantic collaboration between the Hague Institute and the Brookings Institution on the International Justice Law and Policy Briefing Series. This joint initiative seeks to explore complex transnational themes such as the responsibility to protect, countering violent extremism, and international migration in order to shape norms, guide jurisprudence, and offer frameworks for effective policy solutions. I'm delighted that our colleague from Brookings, Ted Piccone, who is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program, is with us today and will serve as our moderator. The Albright Lecture was inaugurated by Secretary Albright herself last June, and she serves as the chair of the Hague Institute's Advisory Council. It provides a platform for the discussion of world affairs in relation to the essential issue of global justice. We hope that this lecture series will help to advance global justice by shaping public discourse and influencing both policy and practice on a range of consequential matters. The lecture this year coincides with the 5th anniversary of the Hague Institute, and is a prime example of our efforts to stimulate thinking and knowledge sharing on contemporary issues at the critical intersection of peace, security, and justice. Today we are privileged to hear from the former Foreign Minister of Canada, Dr. Lloyd Axworthy, who has served the causes of peace and justice both in and out of office. As Foreign Minister, he was an indefatigable champion of human security and provided invaluable leadership to international efforts to ban anti-personnel landmines, to strengthen the responsibility to protect, and to establish the International Criminal Court. More recently, he served as a commissioner on the Commission on Global Security, Justice and Governance, which was convened by the Hague Institute and the Stimson Center, and co-chaired by Secretary Albright and former Nigerian Foreign Minister Ibrahim Gambari. The Commission focused on the critical intersection of security and justice, reflecting a recognition of the centrality of this dynamic to contemporary global affairs. It is entirely fitting, therefore, that Dr. Axworthy should speak to us today on the pursuit of justice in a globalized world, reflecting on the extraordinary career of his good friend and contemporary Madeleine Albright, who has noted that true justice is not an abstract concept, but rather something that makes a tangible and positive difference in people's lives. Lloyd, it is an honor and privilege to host you at the Hague Institute. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and I now invite you to deliver your remarks.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. I say that because if I was actually greeting you in my home site, I would be saying, good morning, everybody. And you would see me in my pajamas, struggling to turn on the coffee pot, handle the dog, and get the papers in at the same time before my wife said, are all three ready? If it indicates to you that there may be some small wavering because of jet lag, I apologize beforehand. I want to make sure that in this day of accountability, we get all the proper sort of issues on the table, and if it leads to some queer aberration of the Canadian or English language. We don't speak the English language anymore since last Thursday. We've sort of decided that that doesn't carry quite the same quality of continuity it once had. I should, just as I said the word, I have this recollection sort of swirling through my mind about giving a talk at the university in Taiwan just after I had left the Foreign Affairs Department. And I had kind of flown through along with a few other convulsions called storms and typhoons. And so when I arrived, there wasn't much time in between actually getting off the plane and showing up at the university. So I'd have to say that the precision of my wit was a little bit muffled. And I managed to stagger through, I think, until question period came. And I want to put out any sort of markers that if you really want to do question period, you have to be ready for the worst. This young man gets up at the back and said, so you were foreign minister living next to the most powerful country in the world. I said, yes. And he said, well, we're living to what is going to be the next powerful country in the world. Do you have any advice for us? Well, up to then, I'd always received, when there was tough, awkward questions, some very smart young Foreign Service officer from Canada would immediately slip a note under my nose. It usually said something, "Say nothing, stupid," I think was usually the admonition. But on this point, I found myself totally kind of flying in the open, and I thought for a minute, and my brain was the synapses were trying to connect, and I said, well, we have an old saying in Manitoba, for those of you who don't get across the pond. Manitoba is the western part of Canada. I said, our saying is that if you're making love to a porcupine, you do it carefully. I don't think it translates into Chinese too well. In fact, no, it didn't, because I got up the next morning very early to do one of these power breakfasts that they do in Taipei. And you know, when you come into a room, some people are feeling well, you can tell the body language. They're not too thrilled to see you. And I said to my host, look, is there something I said? I mean, he said, well, there was a story in the first edition of this morning's paper about your talk last night. And I said, oh, what did it say I said? He said, well, when you were asked how to deal with the emerging power of China, your answer was, well, it's like making love to a concubine. I don't know if that's ever going to go down as one of the sort of primary pivots to Asia that everybody talks about, but nevertheless, I tell you the story only to prepare you for what could be or might be similar little eccentricities that emerge out of my Western Canadian background. And it happens, as they say, a funny way happened to you on the forum, in terms of what I was hoping to talk about, planning to talk about, had talked to Abby about, and all of a sudden get hit by the tsunami that took place in the UK. When I received the invitation to do the Albright lectures, I certainly had a moment of hesitation, caught between the honor of being offered and also being intimidated by a talk that would be of sufficient merit, covering such an important topic of such a credible person, that I wasn't quite sure I was going to be able to sort of put the weight into it. But Abby, to his great credit, as always, was encouraging and thought it might be an interesting thought to break away from all the academic frameworks and analysis that go on and try to understand a little bit the new cosmos that we live in through the reflected lens of Madeleine Albright, who has been like a Luke Skywalker kind of going through this new universe, doing things that may in fact reflect upon the way the world is changing, and probably in her own way establishing some practices and outlooks and commitments that would give a guidance, would give some suggestion about the ways in which we might want to rethink and revise the way in which we deal with the global order. And I was struck by the juxtaposition of the two words, of justice and Albright. It seemed to be a symmetry there, because since I have known her, and it goes back to the times we worked together in the Balkans, she has had a remarkable and intriguing mix of a tough, experienced, realpolitik, get down to business person, with also a very strong commitment to the notion of justice as a compelling principle by which we guide. And that takes forms of ensuring that there's respect and fairness and equal apportionment of participation. That seemed to me a pretty classic and never-ending dilemma and discussion that goes on in a variety of circles that work in diplomatic and political and military, between states and the United Nations and multilateral groups about that issue. And we see it now with the sort of a slow application of the Sustainable Development Goals, the agreements in Paris, the efforts to begin to reorganize some of the most important elements of our international ability. Albie mentioned the responsibility to protect, come to, kind of really grew out of one of the actions that Madeleine initiated. Not that she was planning at the time to become the author of a new international principle, but it was just because it was so clear when the decision was taken to initiate military intervention into Kosovo, not because there was great pools of oil or that there was some demographic shift. It was just that, frankly, for those of us who had been in the foreign ministries around the time of Rwanda and Srebrenica, we just got tired of governments killing their people. Just got really fed up with the notion in the old Westphalian sovereignty that you can do what you want to do inside your own boundaries. And if that means killing 10 or 15 or 100,000, then go ahead and do it. And that I recall very sort of sadly that as I was in the cabinet of the first Mr. Trudeau, I'm giving a talk tomorrow on the second Mr. Trudeau, which I think it sounds like a movie sequel, but it's not. We used to get the reports coming out of Rwanda because General Dallaire was the head of the United Nations police force. And frankly, they made you emotionally, morally ill. The United Nations troops, blue helmets, were in the country, but by the very nature of the mandate, or the limitations of the mandate from the Security Council, they could not step in to protect the people who were being murdered. The Belgians went home, the Canadians stayed in their hotels because there was clear commanding order from UN headquarters that you're not in the business of protecting people. You may protect yourself, but there was no concept of protection of civilians. Now, we think that now that's fairly commonplace. I think we went through a fairly active period of the United Nations to correct that. It's not particularly elegantly, but it's there. But it really began at the first time that there was a clear act of military intervention across the border into, quote, a sovereign country to stop the killing of civilians took place in Kosovo. And for those of us who were involved in the preliminary discussions, the working up to that, we can go through all kinds of the diplomatic sort of maneuvers and dances that were done. By that time, the Cold War had kind of erased any notion of cooperation from the big powers. It was now sort of zero-sum games. And we knew automatically that the Russians would veto any Section 7 mandate from the Council. And so the big debate was, were we prepared to find a legitimate way to go around it? And I don't mean that anyone says that it was warranted under the Charter, but to keep the peace requirements and to protect the people, it became so overwhelming that we had to join. I recall vividly my own experience of having been asked by the Prime Minister, Mr. Kretchen, at the time to report to Cabinet. What would our choice be? And I kind of sat down on a Sunday afternoon with some friends, and we kind of argued everything from just war all the way through as to provide the rationale for this, but simply came down to that: could we stand by and let people be murdered by their own governments? And it doesn't have to be their own governments, by sort of warlords or any other thugs who may happen to be engaged in the conflict. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have legal elegance to it, but it did happen. And the aftermath, the negotiation by the Balkans Tribunal to bring Milosevic to justice, along with 6 of his cohorts, began to demonstrate that there was a slow evolution taking place and a certain revision taking place about the degree to which sovereignty was a divine right, as opposed to something that had to be earned. You had to, if you protect your own people, you are clearly sovereign. If you don't, then your capacity to exercise the ultimate sovereign power may be questioned. The debates going on, I guess, as a result of the Brexit issue in the UK about who is the sovereign? Is it the Parliament? Is it the people? What happens when your parliamentary sovereignty is hemmed in, pieces taken out in order to live up to standards, as Abby said, that have norms beyond those of the nation state, that you're being held to a higher degree or a different degree of requirement and behavior. One that can easily be, and it is being exploited around the world as everybody shuffles trying to find some answer to the major migration crisis, without realizing that the capacity of our notions and standards and institutions that came out of the post-war Second World War, the Bretton Woods, the conventions on refugees, and other issues, just don't cut it anymore. They just are not capable of managing the degree of global risk that is now being faced by phenomena that crisscross boundaries. So, am I getting off Madeleine Albright's track? Not really, because she did take the initiative. She led the group of the willing to become engaged in Kosovo, had been very much the author of the tribunal, the Balkans Tribunal, in which people would be committed for international crimes, not by genocide in this case, but by international crimes against humanity, and that the political arrangements of the time enabled it to happen. I felt, as the Canadian Foreign Minister at the time, that it certainly tackled the issue that Kofi Annan had been raising for years. I mean, the total inconsistency and contradiction in the Charter, that you had to resolve it somehow. We offered to provide money for a UN commission. I think Kofi advised that we don't want a UN commission. It would be, let's just say, too representative. But that Canada could set up its own commission and invite who it wanted. Furthermore, we could also get serious money to do research about the whole issue of state sovereignty versus sort of international norms. Out of that came the responsibility to protect. But I do want to put a parenthesis around. Many of you would know that that was not the first iteration of the word, because I think there's a very interesting historical precedent that we now should be thinking about. That I first heard the concept of responsibility to protect from Sir Francis Dang, who was the Secretary General's Special Envoy for Displaced Persons. This was 2 years earlier, and he came to visit and said that there is a growing and looming issue with the large numbers of people who had no state rights, had no foundation, no anchorage, and that we need to establish, quote, a responsibility to protect for those people. That concept reemerged into the Commission report, and then the history was then endorsed by the summit meeting at the United Nations. But it didn't start around the concept of violent conflict and the use of force against civilians. It started really as a concept, as a way of providing some form of management and protection for displaced persons. Does that sound familiar? when the United Nations just reported this week that there's 65 million displaced persons, and that many of the rules in which we had thought governed their existence are being impugned and just ignored and treated with indifference. But the thing about the R2P concept is that there was a way of saying, of course we recognize your sovereignty, but your sovereignty is also one that recognizes your responsibility, which is for the protection of people. And if you don't live up to that, or if you let somebody else take over from that, the old standard saying, or you were the predator of the action, then there could be international sort of action. It could be preventative, it could be sort of sanctioned, and it could be, maybe, however, far distant, actual military intervention. But it did become that in Kosovo. So when we look at sort of one of the major signposts, I think, of Madeleine Albright's sort of setting in place a factor, a lodestone, I would call it, using mining technology, a place where you go to discover that the Kosovo incident and the fact that there was an international response followed by an international court process begins to say, here are some pathways. Here we've opened up some lines of discussion. Not that they've all been universally applauded, certainly haven't, but they have opened up serious lines of discussion. And as we know, since then, Madeleine has had, and this is why I wanted to use this opportunity, Abby, is that since then she's had a fairly sequential series of similar kinds of impacts through her leadership of conventions. There was the task force in Washington on mass atrocities, where she and William Cohn, who was then a former Secretary of Defense, were asked to come up and with prescriptions for U.S. policy on dealing with mass atrocities, and they came up with a prevention board on genocide. So actually within the State Department, again, we can talk about, and Ted, you probably have some thoughts about how effective it is, but at least it's there. And we consider how exclusionary the United States saw itself from most international agreements, the fact that it would take onto itself the idea that we've got to be prepared to stop mass atrocities. Again, the leadership of that came through sort of Secretary Albright's leading a commission. And I want to pause just for a minute. There was an interesting paper written maybe 7 or 8 years ago by John English, who is a Canadian academic. He'd been a member of Parliament, but kind of went back into the real world and wrote a paper about the roles of commissions and what do they do. Because the world is full of them. We used to have commissions on everything. It's like the Canadian government today. But, we had commissions on women's rights and commissions on social rights and commissions on that were the UN themselves, and everybody else was moving them around. And he said the end reality is that they began to shift the paradigms. Enough people kind of went and listened and got a hold of some of these ideas and transcribed them and brought them. It was like the old idea of bringing smallpox to the New World. You just didn't know you were doing it, but you were sort of spreading it around. And I think that, so you've had Madeleine's leadership of the task force in Washington, and followed by that by the major commission established by the Holocaust Museum and Institute for Peace and the Brookings on the issue of R2P and its application to the United States. But the last place you'd think that would happen. But if you look at the recommendations and the findings, it was very strongly put that this was one of the major tools that the United States needed to begin to look at as a way of responding to the world it was in. There was strong pleas that the president, Mr. Obama, become much more actively engaged in actually using the word and trying to describe the actions of intervention, not in quote, humanitarian terms, because that really is a fairly passive word, but to establish it really as a way of a protective action. And that, again, generated its own discussions. And I can say that just from experience, there's probably now more than 8 or 10, 12 different centers of R2P around the world. You've now got major discussions in Southeast Asia, and the African Union, in fact, is incorporated as part of their charter. You've got actions being justified, and of course we've had the big blow up about Libya. Well, look what happened. It really got knackered at that. Except there's a really interesting article by Bellamy, the two Australian attorneys, Bellamy and Wilkinson, not Wilkinson, who did the study about what happened in Libya and said, R2P became sufficiently acceptable to the Russians and the Chinese at the Security Council that they went along. But soon as a couple of generals from the Brits and the Americans started talking about regime change, the whole thing totally altered in both its capacity, its understanding, and its political acceptance. And so I know that you say that words are used all the time, but it doesn't matter. It does matter. And that they became afraid that R2P was a subterfuge for the idea of regime change, which is a very different set of rationales. So that debate then is subsequent, and then it followed with the last, and I shouldn't say the last. It's certainly, I'm sure there'll be others, but the one that I was involved in, which Abby Williams from here at the Hague Institute and the Stimson people put on security and justice, which had by far the largest remit, by far had the most important kind of framework, paradigm, I feel like, about the integration of justice, security, and the other issues, and a series of recommendations that took us quite far into reorganizing, redesigning the way in which we not only dealt with the issues themselves, but took them out of their silos, and also had some very important recommendations as it came to how do you make it politically capable. I mean, there's no point having a commission if you can't put it into place. And one of the things that I thought was really important about the commission was its recommendations on coalition setting. And when I had been in the Foreign, we had worked on the idea of having coalitions support the landmine and the protocol on children. We were never big enough to push our way around, but we'd get 15, 20 other countries, they'd join us, and these coalitions would overlap, and we'd tie in with others. It was a fairly fluid, ever-moving, ever-connecting thing. It was a little like Stephen Hawking's view of the cosmos. Everything kind of moved around. You could never put your telescope exactly on what was taking place until you heard the Big Bang. But that idea of a networking of coalitions, and networking is almost too static a word. It's a fluidity that is there. And I think that recommendation about how you build a political base, both at the natural sort of international level, but also I think within that report, the clear necessity to bring populations along with you. That you can't do anything if the population doesn't buy in to what you're doing. Again, I think an important lesson to be learned from the experiences of this past week, that too often governments just aren't prepared and aren't listening to what other people are saying. And this phenomenon that we've now seen in the last year or two from Great Britain, from Eastern Europe, increasingly from this part of Europe, certainly the United States. I'd have to say there's one exception. We have a very kind of happy country right now. We just Canada's become the exceptional state. How's that for a statement of fact? I know that. I hope that'll be written back to Ottawa, and they tell me that. But the key question about it is that there was an understanding that this new sphere, some would call it the ecosystem, I call it the cosmos, but that part of the international world that doesn't have as much clear definition. The academics don't study it very much. They'll talk about one civil society here and one here. But back even in the 90s when I worked in the field, you had fascinating conglomerates of international institutions, the Red Cross, the UNHCR, 12 or 14 countries, a international coalition of civil societies, a series of writers and academics, Princess Diana, you name it. It was a very interesting sort of collage of people who got together, developed a plan and prospect, and it became probably one of the most popular international interventions. I mean, we did some scouting and some surveying, and just found out that people, why? Because they thought, it affects me. It's not something that's abstract. It's not something that's way off there. It's not like a trade agreement. Boy, I can understand that I don't want to step on a clump of landmines. But it became properly identified in a lot of people's minds as an effective reaction to the way the world goes. Okay, I know I'm getting close to time. Just a couple of other elements to weave in to the Madeleine Albright sort of contribution. She's also been a mistress of setting up her own coalitions. There's a wonderful organization called Madeleine and the Ex-Mins. It may sound like a vaudeville team that goes on the road, but it does. It's a simple group of former ex-ministers who get together every year to tackle that fundamental issue that we've talked about, and that is the contradiction between international, global problems of such scope and intensity and crossing borders with the classic ability of nation states, even the most powerful, to cope with them, and how you begin to make it work. And every year there's another series of prescriptions, another series of statements, another series of events. But it also means that you've maybe got 15 to 24 former foreign ministers who each in their own capacity have a certain degree of influence, certain degree of sway, certain degree of contact in their own regions. So, Amr Moussa, the former Secretary General of the Arab League, will come and we'll talk about let's have a common water problem for the Middle East. And he doesn't sort of stab me with his cigar pick. I mean, he's very, very polite that way. These kinds of things begin to happen. So there's that. There is the community of democracies that Ted is involved in. Fascinating. It was Garmick, I guess, who co-chaired that with
Poland.
Poland that co-chaired it with Madeleine. But they brought together those who fundamentally believe in democracy and its incidents, not just in terms of the rhetoric of it, but the actual means by which you develop it, support it, maintain it, and proselytize for it. And it has maintained a membership of 20, 30 countries? Well,
the whole, 30 core group.
30 in the core group. But here again is a whole new sort of, it's like a little bit of a virtual arrangement. But those are countries with influence. They got resources. They got things, and they all come together to support certain common project. So, in addition to the kind of conflict security issue, running parallel was Madeleine's interest in developing this community of democracy. And Ted, I think you'll be able to talk to it more than I can, but I think it's got enormous scope. She was the co-chair of the UNDP Empowerment Commission. I sat on that, and it was extraordinary. I mean, Ashraf Ghani, who's now the president of Afghanistan, there's about 5 or 6 people who are now world leaders on this commission. And what was it talking about? The rights of women to own land, to get identity cards, to be able to borrow at a bank, simple things like this, but that's all kind of merged into a new agenda. And if you go to the Sustainable Development Goals that have been placed, that's in the agenda. So all of a sudden, I'm not saying it's exclusively it, but the UNT and UND took that commission report and made it a central focus of its work. So here was an effort on democracy, on empowerment, that I think had she chairs the National Democratic Institute, whose whole sole function is to promote democratic actions in a wide variety of countries. So you've seen that there's a sort of, again, integration of that other side of the equation the democratic side of it, and how that has to be fostered and made more real, made more succinct in terms of what was going on in the world. And if you look at whose fingerprints have been on each one of them, it's been Madeleine Albright's. I'm not saying it's exclusively so, that there weren't partners to work with, but her understanding of how the world had to work incorporated, not only did there have to be a different answer on the security side, there also had to be the development of a kind of democratic foundation, a democratic framework to enable people to feel that they could participate in a degree in making these things work. So when you bring the two together, you realize that there is a coalition. I would say it is more a constellation of activities in that third world, that cosmos, that don't usually fit into the textbook definitions of sovereignty and nation states and governance and multilaterals, but it does fill a lot of space. It's getting bigger, it's expanding its universe, and there are certain key people who have become the key leaders of it, the champions of it. And I think that why does it become for me such a interesting phenomenon, not just for sort of intellectual reasons, but for real reasons, that as we face probably, at least in my mind, one of the most significant global issues in which there is right now virtually no model, no framework, no paradigm, which is the migration model. Vast numbers of people moving, driven by conflict and war and starvation, increasingly driven by climate, lack of water, lack of food. The old institutions just simply can't cope. There's not enough people, there's not enough money, there's not enough authority. I'm reminded that Madeleine Albright was once a refugee. And without throwing the onus around too much around her neck, I'd like to see her pull together all these different strands and weave them into some form of international governance issue on migration that could bring together the different particles and pull them together and do it in a way that would offset, would counter the bullies and the slag artists and the exploiters and the cheap politicians who are now trying to take advantage of the notion of immigration, turn it into the politics of exploitation, and as a result come up with the kind of consequences we've seen this week. There's got to be an alternative to it. Right now there isn't. But what I do see is that the pieces are there. They're floating together like anything in the universe. They've got to be brought together. And if you give any endorsement, I'll call Madeleine after the meeting and tell her she's just been dragooned. Thank you very much for your comment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Axworthy, for that brilliant discussion of the Madeleine Albright contribution and the way in which you really put your finger on the interrelated nature of her own career and the ideas that have animated her own contribution. And the world we face is incredibly complex, and it requires that kind of sophisticated connecting of the dots that you've described so well. And I want to build on that theme in our question and answer. I first want to thank Abby Williams and our partnership with the Hague Institute for Global Justice and the support we've received from the City of The Hague and the Dutch government. It's really been a great series of meetings and discussions, including the Breyer Lecture in April, which Professor Harold Coe led on legal norms as they affect 21st century warfare. And if you're interested in that topic, some very interesting ideas that are available on our website. Let me connect in particular where you left us at the end, the concepts of sovereignty and democracy. We're faced with a very difficult situation. Under international law, it's very clear that sovereignty rests on the authority of the people, as expressed in genuine, fair elections with full protection of human rights. And this is all according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments. But we've seen over the last period, after many years of great progress on democratization around the world, which, as you rightly pointed out, both through the Community of Democracies and NDI, Madeleine has played a very important role. But we're seeing in the last several years a real backsliding in the state of democracy and human rights around the world. Countries that we thought had kind of turned a corner and were moving in the right direction have been going elsewhere. And this is having direct effect on how we conduct international relations and affairs. And I'm wondering, is it time for us to step back and think about why is this phenomenon happening, and be self-critical about, what have we, and I say we, Canada, the United States, Netherlands, other countries that have been big supporters of democracy and human rights, what have we done wrong? What's happening in the world right now, and do we need to rethink our approach?
I don't have any original thoughts about it, but let me just give you 2 or 3 quick comments. First, the issue of sovereignty itself is confused. When we talk about sovereignty, we're not exactly sure what we're talking about, because we're talking about the sovereignty of the state. The issue is then who is the guiding hand of that state? Is it an elected representative body, which is chosen by election, and you say that is the will of the people? But clearly what the Brits say is not the will of the people. We're going to a referendum. We're going right by Parliament. Parliament wasn't even involved in any of this. In fact, Parliament was probably part of the problem, not part of the solution. And yet we think of, and the Brits themselves do, and think in this constitution they have, that it's parliamentary sovereignty. But it certainly was not exercised here. We've been through the same thing in Canada. When we had referendums on Quebec separatism, it was designed not as a parliamentary exercise. It wasn't, especially in federal states like this, it's hard to exercise this. So you're flipping between your philosophers. I mean, between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Hobbes. I mean, you got a big gap in between those 18th century philosophers in which you're building on. Second, I think that the notion of sovereignty, we've never treated it serious enough. It's almost like one of those cows in India. You don't touch it. But we've never really spent a lot of time thinking about how it has been altered. And just look at the ways. I mean, I spoke of one, that the United Nations in 2000, in I think Resolution 1353, Abby, you might remember, the Secretary Council decided that blue helmets could protect people inside somebody else's country. I mean, that was, if you tried that 5 years earlier, you would have been laughed out of the building. But it's now there. Why? Because the other wasn't working. So all of a sudden you totally recorrected or put a different definition on sovereignty. And it just happened because the politics of that time were one that suited it, and people understood the importance of it. Anybody elected, well, I don't have to tell this crowd, but living in the European Union, the number of restrictions on sovereignty, of quote, the national sovereignty, are far too numerous to count. And yet, we're now seeing probably a pushback on that. There's no doubt. And that's where I don't think that we've spent enough time thinking of those issues. The common observation, and I've read or heard since the Thursday vote, was that there was just a group of alienated people who were pissed off that they just had no place in the game. And as an elected politician, I mean, I sat in Parliament, legislature, for 28 years. So I know what it's like to work the streets. I know what it's like to get yourself reelected. And I also know that that is part of making it work. That if you're not there, and if the political system just becomes too entrenched, too hierarchical, then there are going to be people who are underrepresented. And we haven't spent nearly as much time thinking about our electoral systems. I mean, we fall in the trap of its PR. Well, how many stalemates have we had around the world over PR? I got elected under a first-past-the-post system. I loved it, but I loved it because I developed what I think over a period of years, a certain trust with the people who elected me. I mean, there was just that kind of ineluctable connection. But I also knew that I could be kicked out if that tide went against me too. I mean, I couldn't withstand any tide. I stood a couple of tough ones, but those are all issues that I think are on the table.
Yeah.
And you talk about your community of democracies. I just think there's a lot of work that needs to be done because there's no question that the system excludes. And I've seen it. To my mind, the best way to work at it, at least for me, was to be there. I'll just give you an example, Ted. I was having dinner last Friday night with the younger man who succeeded me in my old constituency, okay? And he was saying, he's just been made a minister in the Canadian government. He was all full of that kind of, boy, that's exciting. I got power. But he said, answer me this question. I've got a dilemma. I've been invited to sit on a panel on Monday afternoon when the three amigos are meeting in Ottawa, the Mexican, U.S. presidents and the Canadian Prime Minister. And one of the major sort of think tanks in Ottawa is holding a big panel discussion on continental energy resources, etc. He said, but I've got a real dilemma because back in the riding, it was my riding, so I knew it really well, 3 high schools are holding their graduation. And the thing that was standard is I always ensured that I went to every high school graduation. I gave a $100 book prize. They gave me 2 minutes to blather. But the fallout was everybody said it wasn't that nice he came to the graduation. Oh. And Jim said, well, this is a big deal. I said, Jim, just ask yourself, do you want to make the second election? Never mind the first. Do you want to make the second? If so, put your ass back on Winnipeg and do the graduations.
I think that's
I'm not going to tell you what the answer is.
I think that's a great anecdote because as we're seeing with the European Union, and maybe it's really inappropriate for 2 North Americans to even be talking about this, but there's a sense that maybe we've reached the limits of pooled sovereignty without connecting it back to the voters. And the blowback is pretty strong. Sure. And it's not just in the United Kingdom. I mean, there's a very strong sentiment in other parts of the European Union. And the sense is that Brussels has just become too removed, too remote, away from the people. Even though you do have a European Parliament that has a role to play and there's questions about whether it should have a bigger role and should be back dealing with its constituencies more directly. So to key off of that, there are some commentators who have gone so far as to suggest that Brexit has actually been this dramatic blow to the international liberal order. You gave some good examples of the Paris Climate Accords, SDGs as positives where there is good international cooperation. But certainly we can also name many other areas where there's a real inability to reach any kind of consensus on some really pressing issues. Number one, the migration crisis. Right. And getting at the root causes of the migration crisis is really something that we've been stymied on. We've been unable to find the international consensus. Why, in my view? Because we went too far in Libya, precisely what you said. It became an argument for regime change, and this turned many governments away from the concept of R2P. So I guess my question is whether, given your really important role in the concept of responsibility to protect, do you feel we've also reached the limits there? Is it, frankly, politically speaking, is it dead? And what do we need to do to refashion it in a way that will be more acceptable to other partners in the international community?
Well, no, I don't think it's dead, and I think Albie is probably the best person to answer because I think within the report itself there's a number of ways in which it should be revived. It is being, strange enough, is being revived in other areas other than in the liberal democratic states. Serious discussion going on now in Southeast Asia over this ability to get involved, to support, and you've got China sitting there, which is not known for its tenderness when it comes to interference. But it's the major discussions going on in Africa. So there's a kind of a little bit of a ferment, but it's being applied culturally, and it's getting outside the old colonial framework. I also think that what it needs to do, it needs to broaden its remit. I know that sounds crazy, But just to give you the historical fact, when we were pushing the R2P, the reason we focused on the issue of violence and conflict and stopping people from being murdered is that we didn't have resources to do anything else. I mean, our Foreign Affairs Department at the time was really pretty limited. So human security had 8 different kinds of categories about how you protect the people in disasters, in resource issues, in health issues, epidemics. If someone had increased my budget by 50%, I would have done all 3 or 4. I'd done 3 or 4 of them. As it was, I only had enough to focus on that one. And unfortunately, it's become sort of almost sacred that that's R2P. It's not. R2P is not just the focus on violence and conflict. It has a strong, it has a broader remit, and I think you can unpack it, give it a different name. Call it Mrs. McGilvery's chowder if you want. I don't care. Just do it so that there's a capacity to respond, and also pick up the preventative side of it. We've been so focused, and the academic and intellectual focus has been in terms of the military side, the forceful side. The preventive side, and we now have a new technology, all kinds of new technologies out there that allow us to get him intervene. There's an interesting experiment going on in Timor-Leste, the old East Timor, where it's called participatory peacekeeping, where they're using smartphones. And they distributed smartphones into the population to report on anything they see that might be the forecast or the foretelling of a form of cultural enmity or division, and all people do is they take a picture of a cop beating up somebody, and it encrypts within 30 seconds. So picture's gone. They may write something, it's gone, and it goes into a computer. It's put together. They do the trend analysis and the algorithm, and they pump out the results, and that results goes back out to people, and they say, hey, you got a problem here. You've got a group of people who are really unhappy. They feel that they're not being denied their churches, or they're really, hey, do something about it. So it's an interesting example of how you can get people really involved. I mean, the smartphone has become, I know it sounds crazy, and I'm not here on behalf of Apple. They didn't cover my costs whatsoever. But the smartphone has become a very interesting tool for people getting engaged. They're doing it now in Colombia with the peace agreement. They're now giving out smartphones to the ex-child soldiers to not only report in, but also to do education, and also to help them set up small business and things of that kind. So I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying we've got some new tools. And and if you have an R2P principle, which is to say you've got some responsibility to protect, you figure out the best way of doing it. It doesn't have to be putting the paratroopers in the air, or putting the tanks on the ground, or even putting the CF-18s in strafing.
Yeah. No, I think the pivoting to prevention is really seems to be an important positive way to go. We're also seeing that happening in the space of counterterrorism, where that concept is increasingly being framed as preventing violent extremism, and the Secretary General has a plan on that I think is an important place for many governments to look to for guidance on how to address, again, these root causes. And often it comes back to democratic principles, social cohesion, and integrating populations that are otherwise excluded. Well,
I just want to make a comment.
And then we'll go to questions.
I was listening to the intro from it's not the deputy mayor, Albright, she's the head of isn't it the deputy mayor? Yeah. About the role of the Hague. Look I still have a tinge of, when I hear the word the Hague, I think of one thing. It's providing good, serious rule of law capacity to let people be protected. I mean, you've got the IGC here, you've got the ICC here, there's 160 other institutions. So I don't come to The Hague expecting that I'm going to ride on the Ferris wheel. I think I'm coming here because this really is one of the places on the earth in which the whole question of the rule of law is taken seriously. You have enough people working on it, it's got to be taken seriously. But to what degree is it being kind of intertwined? To what degree is it the interstices being brought together? To what degree is there this kind of, I think the Hague Institute, I mean, I'm not here to promote it, but I thought the report was an interesting way of breaking out of those old silos that we worked in and providing kind of a systems approach to it. But, you know, there's just, I think she was right when she said there's cities, certain places have a capacity to do things that nobody else has. You know, and I think this is probably one of them. I don't live here, I can't tell you, but I just know that in my own romanticism, when I think of the Hague, you know, I am not thinking of going to sort of
beach.
The
beach?
The beach is pretty nice. I've never been invited to the beach, but I'm not thinking that I'm going there, you know, to kind of see Broadway shows. I'm going there because I really want to see if there's some germination going on around these ideas. And I just think that's where we're failing. We just haven't had much in the way of ideas recently. Our champions aren't really sort of out there talking, saying, hey, have you really thought of this?
Well, champions and your mention of leadership, how important it is. And I think we're in a time when we really are looking for important positive leadership. Right. And you've been a great exemplar of that in your career. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions. And I'm sure with this audience, there are a few hands coming up. Why don't we start right here, this gentleman on the left. And there's a microphone coming. If you could just introduce yourself and give us your question. I'll look for other hands.
I'm Willem van Ekelen. Before coming here, I looked up in my notes and I found your report of 2003 on human security, which I think really put human security on the map. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think you had a problem that you covered so much that many people said, well, yes, that's everything wrong with the world, but how can we improve it? Secondly, on responsibility to protect, which also a notion which I very much encourage, but the United Nations General Assembly reduced it to 4 big criminal events like genocide, etc. So in your speech you said now we had to focus on coalition building, if I understood you well. Mm-hmm. But coalition building for what? Can you be more specific on the subjects on which we should focus? In the Netherlands, and certainly after the Brexit, I think we have a slogan which I think may appeal to the people, and that is, we can no longer do it alone. Mm-hmm. And if we have that message, maybe then human security is also a bit better off. But try to be as specific as possible.
Sure. Well, I'm going to come at the last part of your question. I do think that right now, the imminence and risk that is inherent in the migration crisis is so dominant that if we don't get our handle on it, it's going to simply become corrosive, and maybe even spontaneous combustion will just create a kind of series of explosions that will tear so much of our existing infrastructures and rules apart. I say that simply because we started out with a very thin and very inadequate capacity institution to begin with. We had the Refugee Convention from 1951 that only described refugees as fleeing prosecution. It wasn't much to hang your hat on, but even now it's being flaunted. So I think you've got to build up a broader definition. I come back to, here's a thought. After the First World War, there was a surge of Russians and others coming out of the turmoil taking place in the then Russia coming Soviet Union. 1 million people hit Europe. They were all given certificates of eligibility. They weren't given citizenship. They were given certificates that allowed them to work and get health care and their kids to go to school. 1 million people. That's in a time when things were so much smaller. And what it meant is that nobody was thrilled, but everybody kind of settled in. And so when they hit some town, they weren't being moved out on, tarred and feathered or being put into a camp. I think this thing of putting people in the camps is just talk about the wrong symbolic exercise of putting people into camps. I think we're back where we were in the Second World War. And I'm a kid of that. I was born during the Second World War, so I can claim some antecedent. I think that it's big enough and it's covering enough territory. It's not just in Europe. You've got a major refugee flow coming out of Central America, which the United States has not dealt with. They're sending kids back. You've got a major refugee flow coming out of Burma. The ships from Indonesia, Malaysia, and others are arresting them on the high seas and sending them back. They're defouling them, which is against the Refugee Convention. You've got increasingly, there's a study I saw when I was in Israel a couple of weeks ago by an architect who talks about the arid zone, which starts in North Africa, goes all the way to the Middle East, which has less than 200 cc's of rain a year. That's equivalent to my spitting on the sidewalk once a day. It's just no water. What's going to happen when you got no water? You can't grow anything. Your kids starve. You're going to move. You're going to find somewhere to move to. So we've got all these things happening. I'm not saying we should, but there are certainly smart people who said, you can deal with it. First, if you had a burden sharing on resettlement, you could take that surge that's coming about. In Canada, we've taken 25,000 Syrian refugees. We're probably prepared to take another 60. I think we could take over 100 without cracking a sweat. I'll say that tomorrow, but I'm sure I'll get kicked out of the embassy if I do that. But, why? I mean, we're a country of 35 million in the second largest country in the world with an old, aging population. We've got more capacity. The only thing that's holding us back is that we don't have a Department of Immigration that has enough people, and we don't have enough support. We have the public support. You know, the biggest criticism right now in Canada is the federal government's not doing enough to bring refugees. Can you imagine that? The biggest complaint on the hotline shows is those guys are really slowing down. Because we have a program of public sponsorship. Every church in the country is competing with the other to bring a Syrian family in. And, they've raised $40,000. There's a lot of unused capital. I'm being facetious, but I'm saying that there's a lot more space. But there's been people who have taken this idea of the politics of immigration. It's the last stronghold of defending sovereignty, is to say, I can determine who I can keep out, not who I can bring in. To me, it is almost it's a historical endgame that there's very little you can do to kind of change the global economics. You're all tied in to trade. We're all tied into common patents. There's not very much that you can do culturally because everybody listens to the same rock star. But what you can do is say, he can't come in, they can't come in, we're now sovereign. That to me. Now, I just have one thing. I would use R2P in the refugee issue and saying very clearly, and here's me from Canada telling Europeans what to do. My grandparents would be so proud of me. They got kicked out of Wales years ago, and they thought this was great. But simply saying, look, under R2P, you got to responsibly protect. If you don't do that internationally or through our own European agreement, we're going to apply it. And it simply means that if the Premier of Hungary says, I'm not going to spend any money on supporting refugees, which I'm supposed to do under our rules, say, okay, we're going to take the money that we just sent you, to develop a bunch of restaurants and cafes. Give it back. We're going to spend it on refugees. See how he likes that. But I mean, I'm a street politician, so I get a little tougher than other people. I don't dance.
Well, I think you've also just heard what does make Canada exceptional. Although maybe we just need more Canadas. Certainly in the United States, the political mood is very different.
Sure.
But there is a lively debate about opening our borders, which we can talk about as forever. I saw one hand in the way back and then one here. Why don't we take the two together?
Speak loudly. I need to.
Here comes the microphone.
Well, sure, I can do that.
Good,
Hello, Dr. Axworthy. My name is Rick Otten. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a minute ago, you were praising the city of The Hague in the Netherlands for contribution to rule of law, hosting the ICC, and so on. And my question is related to that, because today there are elections in New York for 2 seats in the Security Council, non-permanent seats. Italy, Sweden, and the Netherlands are candidates. And if you were still in office, for which countries would you vote? Thank you so much.
I'd figure out which had the best wine.
Let's take the second question, and then you can figure out how to respond. Over here on the... Oh, there are 2 here. Over there.
I do have an answer.
Thank you. My name is Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry from International Human Rights Commission.
International Human.
Sir, for the past more than half a century, we have been listening, we have been rewinding a video of the Nuremberg trials. And my question to you is, when will be the time that we will see those who initiated, those who supported Iran and Iraq war, 8 years, long 8 years war, those who supplied the weapons during that, the chemical weapons and the other weapons, and then Bush Senior's Gulf War and Bush Junior's adventure of Iraq, now the Libya, where we have more than 3 governments, we had 3 governments, and Libya is still bleeding because of all this situation. So my question to you is, all those who are responsible for this, when will be the time that we will have some sort of Nuremberg trial on earth? When we are talking about justice, we'll have to talk about that. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And we have one more question. Oh. Did you have a question? No, just raising my hand. Okay. Any other questions before we come back?
Go ahead.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you so much, Astrid Thors, the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. But I have also been a member of the European Parliament. And the strange thing is, referring to your story, that when I looked at colleagues who appreciated work in their constituency most, it was the British colleagues. They would always prefer a meeting in their constituency toward, let's say, agreeing on something. So I'm a little bit puzzled by your comment on that. But of course, we have also been thinking a lot, what have we been doing wrong when democracy is sliding back? And especially the case of Poland, where, as you said, Ted, you know, this was one of the founding fathers of the Alliance of Democracies. And I have some answers. We were more talking about winning elections and techniques of winning elections instead of preparing how you would lose election and how rule of law must also be something that comes for the benefit of the small person. Because, I mean, also we must admit that democracy has been really corrupted by corruption in so many countries. So if I could restart some of the process, I would still spread more and more. Rule of law must come first. And when you see names of people who have been promoting, like Yanukovych, and in which campaigns are they? We must also denounce some of those who are, you know, teaching how to win elections for any price and doing it at anyone. And finally, when I move about in countries where I used to work very much as an MEP, like in Slovakia, Romania, and the others, my friends from 20 years back say there, we must go back to basic of what is human rights. It is protection for all of us. I'm saying maybe something that is not politically correct, but we have in parts of the strongest lobbies that have existed in promoting very important human rights, but the general picture has remained unchanged. Or let's say diverted. I mean, this is something, as for you, last Thursday was a very difficult, and Friday morning, waking up to the cauchemar. I would like to quote the former Foreign Minister of Finland, Stubb, who said, I thought this is a nightmare and a bad dream, not the reality. So I'm full of passion what has been happening wrong. Maybe we would try to reset some of the things, but especially what has been done in the name of democracy. Coming back to your question of prevention, responsibility to protect, as William was saying, there were some important principles that might sometimes forgotten. Responsibility while protecting also, I think, is one of the important principles that we... But furthermore, I think, because my work is today to work in prevention, and I think I don't know how you would, if I need to put also a question, which I will, how would the both of you evaluate the World Humanity Forum, which tried to get together resources and commitments exactly to do prevention in a more efficient way. The High Commissioner is there to conflict prevention on interethnic relations, and we do earlier action than many others. But then when we compare with colleagues like the Special Representative of Genocide, we sometimes have the feeling that it's very, very difficult to get the prevention at the right time. Your examples on smartphones and things, I think they are the most encouraging examples of today when people can be also mobilized. So thank you for your lecture. I did find a question at the end, because I wanted just to, all my experience and all I have worked for so many years, because believing, really that integration and the duty of the country where the minority resides, they have the responsibility to protect the minorities. These have been the two ethoses of my political life for 20 years.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your comment as well as the question. On to you.
Yeah, look, I'm going to respond first to, I think you're right about the human rights being in a position of limbo. I think there's all kinds of good things taking place at certain local community levels. But here's something that I don't think it's been talked about much, but that the oldest human right in the world is the right of sanctuary. If you go back into ancient Greek, into the Hebrew Bible, you find that in each of these places, it talks about having specified places where people who are being persecuted can be given sanctuary. We had it in the medieval Christian churches. We still have in part today. We gave sanctuary because we thought that giving people a right to escape from that persecution, from being killed, was a basic. We've never used it in this debate. I mean, we get involved in all kinds of other things about immigration, about how many jobs are created or whatever. We never really talk about the reality that a right is something you defend because it can also happen to you. So I agree with you. We're not, in a way, Ted used the word that the liberal cosmopolitans have kind of taken it for granted that the world is going to be built in their model. It's not. And we've always had bullies and thugs and nationalists and populists and exploiters, but we're letting them to get away with far too much these days. I really do. I just think that there's just not enough real pushback. And I'm a liberal, but I'm saying I can also hit a kneecap when I have to, and will. And I think that under our regime, we have to be able to say, you have to start paying some prices on these things. I also think that to go back to the question R2P, it was never endorsed by the leaders at the UN summit the way it was written. It was compromised almost out of existence. Isn't that true, Abby? You were there. Abby could tell you that when the five great powers got together, they took out a lot of the clauses that were in the Commission and in the Secretary General's report because they didn't want to have to live up to that issue. And it could be extended. I mean, there's no reason. Look, next year is the 30th anniversary. Let's go back and review it. Let's have a people here, your organization, tomorrow, say, let's go back and review it. Is there any reason why we can't improve it? Give it better tools, give it a better political procedure, and do an awful lot more on forecasting and surveillance and early warning and all these things. Get a new kind of a Peace Corps thing going. Peace Corps with green helmets and white helmets and blue helmets, so there's a security tied in with an epidemic. And security tied in with the issue of a natural disaster. People get hurt not just so much by when the storm hits, they get hit afterwards when someone steals, they don't have anything left in their house. And we just stopped thinking these things. I think there's just been kind of a satisfaction with what we're at. And thirdly, we have to start spending some money on these things. We've been living since Reagan and Thatcher on austerity budgets, that everything goes to reducing the role of government. We're paying a big price for that. There was a British commentator, I forget what her name was, she said, I want my country back, my country where I could go and get a decent health service, and where if my kid had a disability, they could be looked after. Or if my father left his job, there would be enough to provide him with a support, and he wasn't left having to cook hamburgers. So we really have sort of, all in the good name of economic stability, have created a society where we do leave people out economically and socially. Americans do that. We do it. We have a very large group of Aboriginals in Canada, which we're starting to pay attention to, but for almost close to 500,000 people who have been left behind for 100 years. And if we're not careful, they're gonna take action as well. So I think that's the interesting thing about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a thing that people haven't really got onto yet. It's no longer north and south. It's no longer rich and poor. It's now universal. Everybody has poverty, and everybody's going to be held accountable to the degree to which they deal with it. So in Canada, if we don't come to grips with the condition in our northern Aboriginal communities, we will clearly be sanctioned, and should be, by the United Nations. Now, what are they going to do to us? Well, simple things you can do. You can't belong to committees anymore. I mean, we have people in the Human Rights Committee, who I wouldn't sort of trust in a dark alley. But you just simply say, you can't do this anymore. And there's got to be some rules along with the principles. And we have to stand up for that kind of thing. And by the way, you want to know who I vote for? I vote for the country that said they agree with what program I would implement when I got on the Security Council, so there would be a continuity.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your words, and we'll have a chance after the lecture to join us for some drinks and further conversation.
Great.
And thank you for your intellectual contribution and your leadership.
I haven't heard an answer to my question.
We can continue the conversation on the break. Thank you all very much for coming.
Okay.
Right.